Okay, we'll wait one more minute in case anybody's running late. I don't want to wait too long, but just in case anybody's a little late from work. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So I decided to do, my computer here. So we have our, bless you, midterm exam in 1 week. Let's just take a look at the calendar. So the week of the 16th is our break. The 9th is going to be our exam. Today will be the review. And the review is just going to essentially consist of going through the example that we did last week. I really want to make sure everyone knows this example 110%. Like there's no part of the example that you don't quite understand. I know we went through it last week and I lost a few people by the end. So we'll go through it one more time because I'm going to tell you ahead of time, this is going to be what your midterm is going to be based off of, okay? So it's really important that you understand this. And then, like I said before, there's a giant shift in the course after this that we go from using Flexbox, CSS Grid, and media queries directly to where we start using higher level CSS frameworks like Bootstrap. So this is like our last chance to get a really good example of how to use these lower level tools, I guess you'd say, of using HTML5 and CSS3 features directly, mostly CSS3. And then after the midterm, there's a shift, like I said, to where we're using higher level tools. Now, it is, even if you never use these lower level things again, like Grid, it is important that you know them because, for example, Bootstrap is based off of, or at least the new version, it's very heavily based off of Flexbox, and you'll see lots of references to Flexbox in the documentation. Okay, so let's go ahead and get a new folder set up for today. So real quick, any questions about the schedule? Is everyone good with the schedule? So review, exam, break, and then last half of the semester. Okay, so let's go ahead and make a new folder for today. Get brackets set up. And I think we're just going to go through this one example today. We'll talk about other things, but I think I just want to go through this one example. This is going to be, we'll just say ex1.html. So if we go to HTML shell under resources, if you remember before, we would just take this, copy and paste. But since we're going to be dealing with media queries, remember that we have to also, under include viewport meta tag, set this to yes. And this sets up something special that lets us use media queries. Just copy and paste that in, save it, and that'll be our starting point. So very briefly, last week what we talked about, just to take a step back, is that every time we've created our pages so far, they've just been for, okay, so taking an even further step back, is that normally when we write our pages, like say block level elements, they take up the full width of the page. And I think there's actually a name for it. I think it's technically called fluid design. Very few people design their pages like that. And that allows you to take advantage of the full width of whatever screen you're on, whether it's a smaller laptop all the way up to a large screen TV if you're browsing on whatever video game system or something like that. Now that can be very difficult to deal with because the way the content flows on the page, it's very dynamic. And so one of the techniques early on in the web that people realized that they could do was create a fixed width page. And so what you do is you take something like a div, make it a fixed width, set margin to auto, puts it in the middle, maybe give it a background color of some sort. And then the idea is any extra space in your page based on the size of the display, it's just taken up by background. So let's say you do a blue background, you just have some extra blue around the border. That worked well for a while, but then the issue that we ran into, double checking here. Okay. The issue that we ran into was mobile. All of a sudden, we've got these very small devices that are orders of magnitude smaller than, say, even just this monitor on my desk right here, probably 10 times larger than the phone I have in front of me. And it's like, how do you display the content in a way that works on both? What early cell phones, or mobile phones, mobile devices in general, so maybe even tablets, what they would often do is they would use this pinch zoom technique, is that you could go to a website and it would display the website, but you, like, to get to any of the content, you had to pinch zoom and then scroll around. And it was a little bit, wasn't exactly optimal, to say the least. So with new versions of HTML, they said, well, let's do this. Well, let's even take another detour here. So what people started to do was they would do browser detection. They would, in JavaScript or other techniques, detect whether you were using a mobile device like a cell phone or, say, a laptop. And then they would redirect you to one of the two pages. Some weren't even that sophisticated. What some would do is they'd say, I remember these .mobi, short for mobile. Domains were popular for a while, and the idea was, if you have a cell phone, you don't go to irsc.edu, you go to irsc.mobi, and you visit our specially crafted mobile web page. Now, that's not really super practical. Why? Because you essentially have to have two versions of the same thing. And by the way, just as a side note, we see this with Android and iOS, is that there's a lot of frustration with smaller businesses that they have to build two separate apps. And so you're seeing actually more and more simple apps just moving to mobile. And these things called PWAs, where you actually just write it in HTML and some backend language or something like that. Anyway, that's kind of a side story. But that's essentially what we saw, is that they're like, why am I going to spend all this extra cost just to make two separate websites? Seems kind of silly. So in the newer versions of HTML and CSS, so HTML5 and CSS3, what they decided to do was to have these things called media queries. And with a media query, what you can do is only apply rules, only apply CSS based on certain screen resolutions, based on certain widths. And this was really convenient because I could still have one web page displaying the content, and then if I am clever about it, I can just rearrange that content, but it's still the exact same content. It's still probably styled mostly the same. It's usually very trivial things like going from a 3-column design down to a 1-column design. And that's where we are today, is that most websites, essentially what you're going to do is you're going to have your content set out, like your HTML and the actual stuff inside of it, like your news articles and so on. And then you're going to have some CSS for things like fonts and colors and that sort of stuff. And then layout specific things that might be affected on mobile. That's what you're going to use these media queries for. And again, one of the most common is to take a multi-column design and collapse it down to a single column. But there's other more advanced things that you can do. But I'm noticing that, probably if I were to make up a number, 80 or 90% of websites are going to just do something simple like that. There's a Mozilla developer advocate, can't remember her name, Jen something. She's got a pretty decent set of videos that go through kind of going past that basic usage. It's considerably more advanced than this class, but it's very, very interesting because most people only concern themselves with the width of the device, but then she does some kind of cool things where you can actually readjust your site based on vertical space too. She does very, very advanced, interesting things that we might see more of in the future. But for the most part, I'm just noticing sites sort of like the Audubon Society, where it's like you take your site and essentially you collapse the number of columns. Now, one of the ways that we okay, so let's very quickly. So we call this responsive web design. It's basically responding based on the resolution of the device or the size of the device. You can see here, well, if we were to go through the try it yourself, you can see here what they would do is they would take, here's the desktop version, tablet version, you can see the phone version collapsed down to one column. So we don't actually necessarily need Flexbox and Grid to do this. Notice that they come up with a very fancy way of coming up with their own 12-column system, and I think they just keep on floating these. I'm sure if we... Oh, I'm surprised they didn't float it. Anyway. So before CSS3, this is what we'd have to do is things like this, come up with our own handcrafted 12-column system. But in new versions of HTML5 and CSS3, we don't even really have to worry about this anymore. Okay. So if you're interested, remember that setting that we had to set? This talks about that a little bit, about this idea of the viewport. Essentially, it's the screen that you're viewing it through. And they come up with their own grid-based systems. But the thing that we care most about are media queries. There's essentially two different ways to tackle your site. You can do desktop first and then create media queries to make it look better on mobile, or create mobile first and then do things to make it look better on desktop. I tend to prefer desktop first, even though the industry, maybe it's just so they can use the buzzwords, they tend to like mobile first. The issue that I find with mobile first is that it makes for a really terrible desktop experience. And you've probably seen sites like this where like you visit the site on a desktop and it looks like just like a very plain site that you can't really tell how to do anything because but so we're gonna stick to developing the site for desktop and then creating rules that make it easier to work with on mobile. Now the way these work are, I've got my CSS right here in my internal style sheet. And then to override things, all I have to do is set up this media query. So in this case, what they're saying is that, okay, normally the background color is going to be light green. Now I'm going to override this rule so we read these top to bottom and then they get overridden as we go down. So I'm going to override this rule when the width of the device is from 0 to 600 pixels, so essentially mobile. And now this is just to give you the visual cue that it's going to go from light green to light blue. And we went over this last week, but I just want to make sure everyone knows how this works. And the idea is that from 0 to 600 pixels, it's going to be light blue. And I know that a lot of this is repeat from last week. It's just very important for your exam that you understand these base concepts, okay? So knowing that, let's take that information about these media queries. And remember I told you you can invert these. We can say min width, but we're not going to really do mobile designs, so I don't really want to waste the class time on it. Just know that you can do that. Hold on. There we go. Just know that you can do that, but we're probably not going to do that very often other than just to show it's possible. Okay, so knowing that, we can go back to our page. And if you remember, so let's kind of just go through the same example last week, and I'll just add more annotations and more explanations than we did last week. So we started off with our site. We created a header. And even if you already did the assignment and everything, it's just good practice. Because I realized by the end I had lost about half the people. And I'll try to go fairly slow so I don't lose anybody. Still streaming with no dropped frames. Perfect. And inside of this header area, we might say, okay, this is where I want to put my navigation. And so it's going to be, if you remember, the logo on the left, navigation on the right. So inside of this header area, I wanted to put a div. Now, normally this would be an image, but we just are being kind of lazy about it. And we're just going to say the class is going to be logo. And we had some sort of navigation. Maybe this week we'll give it a class name. Maybe primary nav. And it's very common to put your navigation inside of an unordered list. So let's go ahead and do that. And I think we're kind of lazy about it. We just did link 1 through 5, or 1 through 4. It doesn't really matter too much. So the idea is that we're going to have on the left-hand side of our page a logo, and then on the right-hand side our navigation. Now to me that's enough to get started. We've got a header. We've got some stuff here. Let's go ahead and style it. So let's make sure we're inside of the head section. Go to Style. Now just a bit of housekeeping. One of the things that we like to do is set the body in HTML to have 0 margin and padding, because by default it's going to have some margin and padding. There are some CSS libraries that you can download, like Reset CSS and Normalized CSS, that will take care of some of these things, but we're not using those just yet, so we have to manually set our margin and padding on the HTML body ourselves. So let's go ahead and, I'll tell you right now, there's not going to be too much to look at. Okay, so we've got link 1 through 4. And I think in this div, we can just put just IRC. So let's go ahead and do that just so we have something there. So on this div on line 23, I'm just going to put IRC, just so there's something to display. So everyone good so far? I don't want to move too fast because you probably know from last time this example gets pretty large pretty quick. Everyone's good? Okay. So let's keep going here. Let's take care of some of this basic navigation stuff. So getting rid of the bullets. So let's start with that. So last week we would have done nav ul, but now we gave it a class name, so what we can do is say primary nav and the unordered list under that. Right, because last week we just had our our element selector, and that's maybe a little bit too broad because if we had created another navigation, but this week we called it primary nav, which is probably a better name. I don't find myself using element selectors really that often. I almost always give something a class name, probably more than I need to. It's just one of those habits that it's like so broad that you end up changing your entire site, and it's not that often you want to change the entire site. Okay, and so let's set up some of the basic stuff. So we wanted to set the list style type to none. I teach a Visual Basic class, and it's super frustrating. In Visual Studio, it's tab for auto completion, and then I get, a few hours later I teach this class and it's enter for auto completion, so it seems I'm always backwards. But okay, so we set the list style type to none. So that'll get rid of the bullets, and you'll notice here that there's some extra either margin or padding. Let's just zero that out. We'll decide what to do with it later. Now note, we're not setting it on the class primary nav. The class primary nav is that nav. So that gets rid of some of the extra stuff there. Now with this navigation, what I want to do is make it display as a row, make it display horizontally. So what I can do is I can use Flexbox for that. That's a pretty good example, because what I do is I set it on this UL, on the container, and then the individual list items are the items inside. So if I set it here, display flex, then all those individual LIs are going to display in that direction. Now, what we have here is that we have two rows of stuff. I don't know if that's the best terminology, but so we've got the header, and then within the header we've got this div, and then we've got this navigation. And then we look at this, and this makes sense because, okay, here's that div, and then here's the navigation underneath it. What I want to do is I want to put this logo on the left, and I want to put on the same line, I want to push this navigation all the way to the right. Well, what can do that? Flexbox. Flexbox is really good at that. Now, it might be a little bit confusing because we've already, on this navigation, we've already used Flexbox, but remember, we can put Flexboxes inside of Flexboxes, just like we can put divs inside of divs. So what I can say is on the header, the header's the container, and then it's got two items. And then this also sets display, this right here, this UL sets display to flex, but that doesn't really matter. It doesn't really care about that. So we can actually have things embedded. So we go back up here, and here we'll be lazy because we know the header's just going to occur once. Usually, again, I would give it a class name, but in this case it doesn't really matter as much. And by setting header to display flex, what's happened is I've taken this div and this nav, and now it's basically this header is the container with two items. Now don't be confused that it has a bunch of sub items. That doesn't matter. All it does is it looks at the top level thing. So as far as the header is concerned, all it needs to flex is this div and this nav. And visually, this may not line up with your thinking of how you'd want to see it. So last time what we talked about is we said, okay, well, what I want is I want this all the way over here. I want the links spread out evenly at the halfway point in the page. So hopefully you remember, if I've got items and I want to justify them in a specific way, I can do that. So if I want to put one thing all the way to the left and push another thing all the way to the right, I can set this property justify content to space between. So let's go ahead and do that. And so we're going to set that on header because I want to push the logo to the left and the navigation to the right. And so we're sort of getting there. But now if you remember, I told you, I said, okay, right now this is actually, there's a dividing line down the middle of the page because I've got this is taking up half and then this is taking up half. What I want to do with this other embedded Flexbox inside of the Flexbox is I want to say, so each one right now, we can just say they each have half. What I want to do with this is say, okay, with my half, I want to justify its content to do the same thing. I want to set space between on all these items. So we'll go back here. Remember, this sets the link 1 through 4, or link 1 through 5, where we said. And we can also set justify content space between here as well. Now we're almost there. What we have to do is set one more property that basically says, okay, how much space I actually want to take up. And there's this flex property, shorthand for a bunch of other flex properties, that if we want them to take up equal space, we just set it to 1. So what that means in practice is that for, I think where we can put it, probably here is fine. So on that primary nav class, I want it to be the same size as the logo. I want them to take up equal space. Otherwise, what happens is it kind of shrinks it. And so now what I'm saying is I kind of lied before and I said they're taking up half. Here they're truly taking up half because this is saying, okay, take up as much space as you can. Well, and it's a ratio. It's saying, okay, I want the maximum amount of space up to this ratio with everyone else inside of the Flexbox. But because they're both set to 1, each gets 50-50. You could say, for example, you wanted the logo to take up 2/3, 1/3. You would set this to keep this at 1 and set this to 2. I think we tried that last week and just didn't space out very well. Okay, so this kind of gets us what we want. Again, you could mess with the ratios a little bit, but just for basic layout purposes, this is good, is that we've got a logo over here and we've got our links over here. Now, this is kind of responsive, but usually what we do is we like to set these different breakpoints, and these breakpoints, even though it's an older technique, this idea of having a fixed width container, we can still use that. We just modify that along different screen resolutions. We have various breakpoints. Okay, if you remember, we tended to call that class container. So let's go ahead and say, okay, we're going to have a container of some sort. And we want the width of that container to be 1200 pixels. And because we want it centered in the page, we're going to set the margin to auto. And it's not going to do anything yet because we haven't actually applied it. So the next thing we need to do is to wrap our content inside of this container. So we'll just kind of make, we could make a dummy div, but what I'm going to say is that we actually don't even really need that. We can just apply it to the header and say, and so this is acting as two things now. It's acting as the header and the container. A little bit difficult to see, but hopefully you can see that it's actually inside the container. And then this is probably 1200 pixels. And you can actually see the horizontal scroll bar because we said it's 1200 pixels, so that's what's, but you get the idea, is that we've got essentially a fixed width container, and every once in a while we're going to adjust that container size. Let's do a couple of visual cleanup things just to make it a little bit nicer. It's not going to be perfect, but I could set a background color here, so don't type this because I'm going to change it. Let's do a darker, something blue. Oh, this looks interesting. I think this will work. But a common technique these days is to have that background color go the full width of the page. And so what you have is your content constrained by a container. And we can see that here, but we want this background color to go the full width of the page. So what we have to do is create kind of a dummy outside of header. We want to go ahead and create just like a dummy div. We could probably give it a class name, but it doesn't really matter too much for this example. And then we'll apply it here. Now let's just do a couple of visual touch-up things just to make it a little bit easier to see. So we'll say all of the text inside of the header, because it's sitting here, let's go ahead and make that white. Give it some padding on the top and bottom. I think we used 20 pixels last week. And we could even set the font size. (25 pixels), maybe font weight bold. In practice, on the left here, this would probably be an image. These links are probably a little bit too large, but I don't know. I'm not going to get too much in the detail. We can read it. We can see what's going on. That's all that matters to me really right now. So this will be our point to pause to make sure everyone sees what's going on. But what I'll do is I'll slowly scroll through this code in case anybody missed anything. Now, just to take a step back regarding what we did, is that we started off and we said, okay, we want to have some sort of header section. And in that header, we're going to have a logo on the left, navigation on the right. So that's what we started off with. We just had a header. Right now, this is a logo as a div, but you could make a real logo later. And then we said, okay, we're going to have a navigation. And because we wanted this navigation as an unordered list, that's what we did. And we started off just saying, okay, I just want two classes, one to style this logo and one to style the primary navigation. We took care of some detail work, got rid of the bullet points, got rid of the margins. And our main idea here was that we've got two items. We've got this logo, and then this whole thing right here, all four of these links, all are under nav, so they're considered one item. So what we did is we made a Flexbox where I've got this, and then this all as one thing. And then what I can do with that is I can say, okay, set display to flex, set the justify the content to space between, and because there's only two items, it did that. But we had to set flex to 1, which is a special property, to tell them both, hey, just take up an equal amount of space. Otherwise, it wouldn't have really wanted to take up any space. Now to adjust these links, what we had to do was put them in their own flex box, because this whole thing is taking up half, this whole thing is taking up half. And then put these links in here and say, okay, for these links, make them flex and set their justify content property to space between. And that allows us to get this effect of the links on the right-hand half and the logo on the left-hand half. The other thing that we did is we decided to put this whole thing in a container, and then we're going to adjust that container based on various breakpoints. This is super common in Bootstrap, by the way, is that we have two container classes. By default, we have one called container, and then we have another one called container fluid. And it's been my experience that people tend to more often use container than container fluid. And then we did a little bit of detail work just to make it a little bit more readable. And that's where we sit right now. Okay, any questions on any of that so far? Let's go ahead and tackle the rest of the HTML. So I've got that right here. And then maybe I have an H1 that serves as the title of the page. And like I said last week, don't forget, we still have these simple properties when we're dealing with simple things. If I'm dealing with a single line of text, like I'm working with here, there's no reason to get into more complicated things other than I can just set text align center. And then this will center the text in the page. Now that doesn't hold when I'm doing many other things, but in this case, if it's a single line of text and I just want to center it in the screen, just keep simple things simple. And again, you might make your own dedicated class for this as well, but for now, we'll just makes the demo a little bit easier if we use some inline CSS. Now for the main content of the page, let's go ahead and wrap this in main. And we're going to have a bunch of articles. And so what we want to do is knock out the first article, and then we'll do some copying and pasting. So we're going to have an article class. I'm sorry, article element, article tag. And then that's going to have an image at the top, which we'll fill in later. We'll have an H1 that just says my story. And then a paragraph of lorem ipsum. So let's go ahead and grab that. Okay, so this is going to be the setup for the HTML. So we've got main. Inside of main, there's going to be multiple articles. So the image is going to be $237, which I think was the dog. I think if you hover over it, it'll. There we go. So my article is going to serve this function as a card. We've seen this before. Remember in the Audubon Society examples, each news story was a card. It had like an image and then some sort of title and then some text and then read more at the bottom. And so we'll go ahead and call it card. I think in the end, I don't think we actually ended up using this, but it's nice to have. And then this is going to be card image because I know that we're going to be doing some responsive styling on this. Now you could also do some styling for H1 and paragraph and so on, but for this simple example, I'm not going to bother. So you could call this like card title, card content. Okay, so make sure you have this set up 100% correct because we're going to do lots of copying and pasting. So inside of main, we've got this article that's going to be in this class card. This class card image, which points to this image of the dog. We've got our H1 and our paragraph. So we want this a total of 4 times. So I'm going to copy and paste it in 3 other times. So this is number 1, 2, 3, 4. Make sure that was all inside of main. So I have main, article to article, article to article, article, and then close main. If I view this in the web browser, it's not going to be particularly interesting. First of all, the image is very large, and it's all just taking up the full width of the page. So let's do this. Inside of main, let's go ahead and let's create a class called stories. These might be some sort of articles or stories or something like that. I'll call it stories. And we'll go ahead and put that here. And remember, stories is going to be a grid. It's going to be like the Audubon Society, the individual stories there. So I'm going to set display to grid. And I want a 4-column design. So the property we used for that was grid template columns. And the idea is that, well, let's type it. So I'd say grid template columns. Now we could set it using pixels, but they actually have their own native unit, the fractional unit. I want them to all be the same, take up the same amount. So I'm going to set them all to 1. But if you wanted like a 2/3, 1/3 type deal, or like, you know, something else, you have that option. But here I'm going to say I want a 4-column design with each of those cards taking up 1 fractional unit. Now what happens when I add a 5th? Does it like get confused and not know what to do? What happens? Does anybody remember? It jumps down and wraps around to the next line. And this is very convenient because if I had 12 things, I would add my first 4. It would say, okay, you're out of columns to use. Let's jump down to the next line. I populate the next 4. It said, okay, you're out of columns. So this turns out to be really convenient because you don't have to know how many things you have. You just know how many columns. This is common when you're retrieving results from a database. You want some flexibility. And so this gives you that. You just tell me how many columns, and I'll figure out how many rows to put it on. Now, this isn't quite working as we had hoped. Now it is displaying as a 4-column design. The problem is that the image of the dog is so large that it's causing problems. So let's go ahead and take care of that. Now you might ask, why did I choose such a large image of the dog? Is because we can use responsive images to automatically resize. This is very convenient because if we choose a large image for, say, desktop, we can use the same image and just have the browser resize as necessary. And so we don't have to serve up different images based on different sizes. So it's very useful. We call it card IMG. And so what we do is we say set the max width to 100%. So it's saying take up as much room on the width as your container allows. And then from there, automatically recalculate the height based off of that. One thing that you have to be careful of is that to do this, you generally have to have images of the same, not even necessarily size, but at least the same ratio for this to work and display halfway decent. Okay. There are ways of auto-cropping images as well. There's a property called object cover, and you can set it to where it'll try to stay in the center and then auto-crop. The property is called object fit. But for the most part, it turns out in practice it's not that huge of a thing just to crop your images before you upload them to be the same, either ratio or size. Usually people just stick to the same size. Okay, so we do that, and now magically we've got the image automatically resized to the width it needed to be. Now we're sort of getting there, but usually if we're going to use this container, we want to put everything in there. So let's go ahead and take this main, which surrounds everything, and don't forget that we can actually apply multiple styles. And so, okay, it's serving one purpose for stories, but I also want to contain it. So I can say apply the rules for stories and container. Now, they're all squished together. So if you remember, there was a property called grid gap that set the gutters. There's individual properties, get grid column gap and grid row gap. We can set them individually, or if we just said grid gap, it sets the row and the column. So under stories, let's go ahead and set that property grid gap just to clean it up a little bit. Let's see, 10 pixels. And that just cleans up the grid a little bit. It gives it a little bit of space. Okay, and then this is a good time to pause. So we're getting there. And this is really interesting because I think for most people in this class, this is probably the first time you've done layouts. Just show of hands, how many people have done layouts like this before in your other classes? Imagine this is probably the first time, correct? Like you mostly focus on like colors and fonts and maybe some JavaScript, but for the most part you haven't done layouts. So this is cool because this is a really powerful technique. With just this tool, you can do all kinds of really interesting things. And you can set up your grids all kinds of different ways, okay? So there's a site here, Grid by Example, just to give you some ideas. A site that I've noticed that does some very clever things with grid. I don't know if they specifically use grid, but they use, you know, maybe they use a lower level technique, I don't know. But grid-like things is New York Times. Now, I'm always, again, I never know what's going to be front page news on a daily basis, so I'm afraid to bring it up. But if you scroll down, especially to the stories near the bottom of the page, they'll come up with really, really interesting things where it almost fits together like puzzle pieces. You're like, wow, that's interesting. That image took up some ratio of the screen, and they've got the text flowing some interesting way, and then another image in some weird spot, and then that kind of flows into the story next to it. They really, really make an efficient use of screen real estate. Not saying that this method right here is bad or anything. It's very clean, so it's one way. But if you've got a lot of content on your site, sometimes you have to start getting clever. And so you can get clever with some of these good things. Now, obviously, with anything, you can overdo it. But, you know, a site like New York Times, they probably want to get as many news stories on the page as possible. So let's do a very quick 1-minute summary of what we did here. So we created an article, and that article has an image, a title, and a paragraph. And we said, okay, well, this main right here, this is going to serve as our grid. Let's go ahead and make a class here called stories. And so stories is going to be a grid, and I'm saying that I want it to be a 4-column design. If I add more news stories, it's great, automatically wraps around, goes to the next row. Let me just show you that. You don't have to do this, but I just want to show you that's what it does very quickly. So if I take this and make a 5th article, it's going to say, oh, don't have any more room. Go ahead and wrap around. It's very convenient. The reason that's so convenient is because many times you're going to be getting results back from a database, and I don't know how many I have now. I think this is probably the right amount. Okay. So we did that. We set up a grid, a 4-column design. We set up the image to be responsive, so it's going to take up as much width as it should. And then it says, okay, automatically readjust the height of the image. And then we just added a little bit of gaps. So this is okay for desktop. You could set up, a color scheme, add the footer, do other things, actually make these real news stories. But the problem that we run into is that it is not responsive. This is only going to really reasonably work on desktop. So what we can do is we can say, okay, well, we just learned about media queries. Let's go ahead and so the magic number is 1200. As soon as we hit 1200, it's not going to work anymore, a width of 1200. So wider than 1200, everything's great. But as soon as you hit 1200, you can see, well, the browser is more narrow than its container. So it ends up with this horizontal scroll, and that's just not going to work too well. So what we have to do is we have to set up a rule at 1200 pixels. So what we do is we say, this is where we set up our media queries. We say at media, only screen. Don't worry about this only screen. We're just going to put this every single time. I think it actually even works without only screen. But we'll just to be safe, we'll put it. And we'll say, okay, up to 1200 pixels. So I'm going to say max width. So up to 1200 pixels. At the very least, I know that container, it's not really practical to have that container to be 1200 pixels anymore. So remember, we set this container to 1200 pixels. Now what we're saying here is from 0 to 1200 pixels, I want to do something different. Larger than 1200 pixels, it leaves it alone. It just says, so if we've got a 1500 pixel width, this would still work. But I'm saying from 0 to 1200 pixels, I gotta do something else here. Now I don't have to rewrite the entire rule. What I can do is I can say .container. I still like that margin auto. That's a nice feature for me, but I just want to change this width. And let's just say, to be consistent with last week, I want the next breakpoint down to be 700 pixels. So what I'm going to say is, okay, well, when I hit a width of 1200 pixels, go ahead and make the container a little bit smaller. And we see that here. Let me go ahead and adjust the height as well. Is that, okay, this is fine. This is greater than 1200 pixels, but as soon as I hit 1200 pixels, you're going to see the container readjust. By the way, don't worry, there's always some stray pixels. For this class, I'm going to generally ignore that. In the real world, you would have to account for those. But notice that you saw that right at 700 pixels it readjusted. It said, or I'm sorry, right at 1200 pixels it readjusted and said, okay, container, your new size is now 700 pixels. But, and let's say, for example, 700 pixels, that represents maybe tablet size. 4 columns works on desktop okay, but we might decide that doesn't really work too great for tablet. Let's adjust this to a 2-column design. So we can go back in here as this media query that says from 0 to 100. So basically you can think tablet. On tablet-sized devices, I readjusted the container. But now remember that stories, that grid, that 4-column design? Let's go ahead and say that's going to be a 2-column design now. So all we have to do is set this one property. We're okay at being a grid. We're okay with this grid gap. What we want to change is this grid template columns to 2 columns. And all we do is set 1FR, 1FR. I'll try to wrap it up soon because I realized many people still haven't turned in the assignment, so I want to give you a chance to still work on that as well. Hopefully this second time through, seeing the example, it kind of solidifies a little bit. Every once in a while, it's important to do these very large examples, even though they're very tough logistically, because if you make a coding mistake, it's hard to catch back up. But they're very important to see complete examples. That's always the frustrating thing I always had in school was I would see partial examples, and I would never really see a whole lot of very large completed programs. And it's kind of nice to see those every once in a while. So now you'll see as soon as we hit that breakpoint, jumps down to the new container size, but now we're also 2-column design. And because we had 4 items, it did the 2 items and then it wrapped around. So this is perfect. Now, the jump from desktop to tablet isn't huge, but what we typically, let's say for example, this is in this range, we're starting to get into mobile. Multi-column designs in mobile tend not to work super well. So what we tend to do is just say, hey, at mobile, just collapse everything down to 1 column. So let's go ahead and make another rule. Now remember, these go top to bottom. So all this stuff up here, my CSS up here, this is the default. This is how it normally acts. But now here I'm saying, okay, if it's from 0 to 1200 pixels, act this way. Now we're going to put another rule here that says from 0 to 700 pixels, if I'm even smaller, act a different way. So we're going to do, set this up only screen, and with 700 pixels, now the container, we're not going to worry about that anymore. We're just going to say container, take up the full width. We're not going to mess with pixel sizes anymore because it doesn't really matter. Just take up the full width and everything else kind of works itself out. Now it should be fairly obvious that we also want to take this 2-column thing with stories, squish it down to 1 column. Now, one of the things you'll notice is that, again, this 2-column header doesn't really work that great. So what we often do is we want to squish that down to 1 column as well. And because these are both Flexbox, all we have to do is set, by default, the flex direction is row. All we have to do is set that one property, flex direction column. So the outer thing, the header, contains this and then these as a whole. So let's go ahead and set that. Make sure we're inside of this media query. So we'll set header, collapse it down to column. But still, it's very rare that we see even the links over here like this. And so what we want to do for those as well, I can't remember, I think I call it primary nav. I think I need the unordered list underneath the primary nav. And then also set those as flex direction column. Now everything's just one giant column. And I think I mentioned this on the assignment. What we typically actually do is we put this little kind of menu button up here, and then we'll just have some JavaScript that all it does is it shows and hides. So as soon as you click it, it'll expand out this. It's pretty simple. You just do like, I can't remember the property. I think you set the property to display none versus display block. So you do like get element by ID, grab the ID of the button. I'm sorry, grab the ID of this. We'd probably want to do it right here. And then, so get the ID, give it an ID, or you could do a selector, grab the class, and then just from there you can actually, in JavaScript, you can actually set CSS. So you'd set its display property to none or block. But it's fine for here if you don't want to do it. It's just giving some tips on what to Google if you want to try to do it. Usually, I've used assignments where I've said that you can do show hide for extra credit. Usually I get quite a few people that at least try it. So. And I think that's about as much as we can do with this. So taking it all the way back. So here, this is on the desktop. This is, oops, let's take it one step at a time. Okay, so here we have desktop. We have that fixed width container. As soon as we hit 1200 pixels, we go down to, say, tablet size. And we just said, oh, okay, readjust that container and set it to a 2-column design. And then as soon as we hit mobile, just collapse everything down to 1 column. And that works. Now very quickly, because this is going to be important on your assignment, I don't pull these numbers just out of thin air, okay? We've got a container that's 1200 pixels. Its relation to this breakpoint, the idea is that I've got this container and it's containing something. When the browser width is smaller than my container, and that's what this breakpoint, this media query right here represents, is that I'm saying, okay, I arbitrarily said at 1200 pixels, that's when I'm going from desktop to tablet. And I need to do some things at that 1200 pixels. So don't just pick random pixel sizes, because this is important. like I'll say set the breakpoint, on your assignment you have to change things in multiple spots. You can't just change it here. You have to go back and change things like container and any other spots. I think it's just container, but there might be other spots. And then same thing here. So the new container width is 700 pixels. We're saying, but now when the browser is even narrower than 700 pixels, this container isn't going to work anymore. So now we have to set it here. Okay. So just keep in mind that when you're changing things, you have to change them in multiple spots. You can't just set it in this one spot and expect credit, because it requires not much more thought, but a little bit more thought. And that's why I didn't just give you the answer in the directions, because it's like, you got to kind of think about it a little bit. You have to say, okay, what's actually going on here? Okay, so any questions about this? Now this relates very closely to your assignment. Let me just go through the directions once very quickly. Okay, so you're going to change it from a 4-column design to a 3-column design. You can either use today's example or last week's. They're very similar. And then at the first breakpoint, switch to 2 columns, and then so basically like we did. But now you need to have 6 cards rather than 4. Add a footer. The footer styling should be similar to the banner. That should be obvious. Sometimes people just throw in a footer with no styling at all. And then here's the breakpoints: 1,000 pixels and 600 pixels. Like I said, you can use the show hide, and then try to dress it up a little bit to make it look like a more usable page. I realize because of time constraints that's not always practical, but make it feel a little bit less like a skeleton page and more like a real page. It doesn't need to be super detailed like some of these other pages where you have all kinds of stuff on there, but make it feel a little bit less like a layout skeleton. Okay. So any questions? Okay, so I realize a very, very small handful of people have finished this and turned it in, but most people haven't. The vast majority of the class hasn't. So for those that have turned it in, you're welcome to head out early. Just make sure to study this, because this is going to form the basis for your exam next week. Is that I'll give you a kind of half-completed page, and I'll tell you to do different things with the number of columns and so on. For everyone else, you can take about a 10-minute break and just work on it for the rest of the class. As you have questions, you can raise your hand. So any last-minute questions before I lose some people regarding the exam or anything like that? I guess I got to go over the rules. Yeah, question.
How's the next exam going to be structured?
Yeah, so let me talk about that now. Okay. I'll do this as an announcement as well, so it's written. I guess I should have started off with that. Okay, so it is. So you can use any previous class examples or assignments. You cannot use any websites. All you can have open is Blackboard. Can't use any sort of books or written notes or anything like that. It's going to be very similar to an assignment. So what I'll do is I'll give you something maybe resembling this, like some sort of skeleton page. Maybe I'll take an example like this and subtract some things out, and then I'll give you a number of steps. And so I might say, okay, change this, change the breakpoint from 1200 to 900. And usually because you're under time constraints, I'll usually give you more specific steps along the way. But what you'll have to do is be able to take a page like this, and this is going to be sort of form the foundation of it. Take this and modify it. Does that make sense? So again, I'll give you steps. I might say, it's actually going to be somewhat similar to the assignment, but I'm not expecting you to kind of dress it up and actually make it look nice. I'll give you a set of steps that says, okay, change it to this number of columns, maybe add margins and padding here, add a footer, change this color. It will be coding, no multiple choice, no short answer or anything like that, but because you have your previous class examples, it turns out it's not as bad as it sounds, okay? And it's only worth 10% of your grade. Part of it is just to kind of get you in the mindset of, okay, now I know how he gives his exams, so when we get to the final exam, you'll have a better idea of how to study. It's really about the point amount as typical assignment.
We use the computers on the midterm?
Oh, yes, correct, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so you'll actually be coding on a computer. It's not like you have to handwrite any of this stuff. Okay. Any other questions?
How long is the midterm?
I usually do about half the length of the class because otherwise it gets a little bit too long. So probably about an hour and 15 minutes, maybe round up an hour and a half. Because what I've noticed is that at that point, if you can't finish in 90 minutes, the chances of you doing anything with that extra hour are usually pretty low. So I usually just make it an hour and a half. Plus a 2.5 hour exam is a little bit cruel. So, any other questions? Okay, so again, for the few people that have finished, you don't have to hang out. For everyone else, take a little bit of a break. I'm going to post the code, even though it's essentially the same exact code as before. It's maybe slightly different. And then just spend the rest